Let's pause the clock. Trying to come up with a new catchphrase, y'all, for next year. Did you get that one? Let's pause the clock. I'll let y'all think on what that means while we go over the answer key to the experimental design practice. Let me know in the comments below, and the comments would be hitting the reply in this discussion board. So here's my strategy on how to quickly identify the different variables and the different groups. In order to determine the variable, we need to know what is being tested. So the independent variable is a variable you can manipulate or change. You can control this variable. This is the one that causes something to happen. The dependent variable is a variable you measure. This variable reacts to something. Moving on to groups. The experimental group is the group that usually is treated with something or something different, or is different. And the control group is considered to be the baseline, something you can compare to that is considered normal. So with these key concepts, let's apply them to the 6 different problems. Let's go. Problem number 1. A study was created to test the effects of jazz on people's sleep patterns. The hypothesis of the experiment was that if people listen to jazz music as they fall asleep, they will sleep for longer periods of time. For the experiment, 2 groups of people were created. One group was placed in a quiet room where they went to sleep and they were timed on how long they slept. The other group was placed in a room where jazz music played softly as they began to sleep and played throughout the night. As each group awoke, their sleep times were monitored. To identify the variables, we need to know what is being tested. This, y'all, is crucial. This is the only way to identify the variables. So we are testing whether music has an effect on the length of sleep. So here, our independent variable is music. And our dependent variable is the one reacting to music, is the length of sleep. Once we know the variables, it is easy to identify the groups. The experimental group will be getting the independent variable. That's the jazz music group. And the control group is the baseline. And here, the baseline will simply be no music group. Problem number 2. Clarence and his friends have always been way more interested in girls than in graduating, so they decide to spend all of their time and focus on trying to date as many girls as possible. They start to wonder if there is anything they can change about themselves and to make it more likely that the ladies will say yes to their date request. After some careful consideration, Clarence and the group come to the conclusion that the type of clothes they wear will make a big difference. So half of the group spends the month wearing their normal greaser clothes and asking one girl a day. The other half of the group spends the month wearing goth apparel and asking out one girl a day. At the conclusion of the experiment, a tally is made of how many girls accepted the requests of each group. So this problem was pretty wordy. The guys wanted to test the types of clothes and that effect on the number of dates. The independent variable was the type of clothes, while the dependent variable was the number of dates they got. Once that was determined, it was easy to identify the experimental and control groups. The experimental was the different clothes or the goth group, while the control group was the baseline or what they called their normal greaser clothes. Just to note, this experiment was pretty bad because there were more factors that come into play than just clothes. That's called the confounding variables. To name one from this example, personality could also affect the number of dates that these guys could get. So they didn't consider this when designing this experiment. Problem number 3. Chloe is a personal trainer at Gold's Gym. Although she has always officially led a straight-edge lifestyle and denounced the use of anabolic steroids, she always secretly wondered if they helped people get significantly stronger. She decides to find out. She purchases some steroids off the black market from her dealer, Jiggy, and convinces half of her clientele at the gym to start injecting. This continues for 30 days while Chloe keeps a journal of how much weight each person in the two groups can squat. At the end of the month, she compares the results. Chloe wanted to test the effect of steroids on the amount of weight each person can squat. So use of steroids is the independent variable, and the dependent variable is the weight that each person can squat. The experimental group is the group that gets steroids, while the control group is the group that does not. Too easy, too easy. Problem number 4. The local high school recently passed a rule reducing how much teachers can count homework as part of a student's grade. Consequently, a larger portion of the students stopped doing their homework. A teacher there decides to conduct an experiment. Because he's worried his kids won't do any formative work, he allows the students in 2015 to use optional test guides that they must fill in and complete on their exams. That gives them access to definitions of terms. He rationalizes that students will complete the test guides and learning will occur from filling them out. A year earlier, in 2014, the teacher did not allow students to use test guides on the exam, and consequently, very few of them filled them out. After the 2015 year is over, he wants to compare scores between the 2 years on the AP exam to see if allowing students to use test guides throughout the year improve their later overall performance on the AP tests. So this teacher wanted to see if the use of a test guide and the effect on the AP exam scores. The independent variable is the use of test guides, and the dependent variable is the AP exam scores. The experimental group is the group that got to use the test guides on the in-class exams, and the control group did not use that test guide. Problem number 5. Shortly after adopting his cat Sassy, Thomas realizes that his poor kitty isn't eating very much. After ruling out any confounding variables, he determines that Sassy is a huge diva and is simply very picky about the type of food she eats. He decides to run a month-long experiment separated into 4 weeks. During the first week, he feeds Sassy normal dry food. During the second week, he feeds her wet canned food. In the third week, he gives her raw salmon. Finally, throughout the 4th week, Thomas feeds Sassy a home-cooked meal of liver and gravy. At the end of the experiment, Thomas compares how much of each type of food Sassy ate. Thomas was trying to test what type of food the cat preferred, and that can be measured in the amount of food eaten. Therefore, the independent variable is the type of food, and the dependent variable is the amount eaten. The experimental group was pretty difficult here because there were 3. The experimental groups were eating wet food, eating raw salmon, and eating liver and gravy. We have to assume that the cat was normally given dry food, and so this dry food is considered the control group. Problem number 6. Dr. Kopis is in charge of the cognition department at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. A new drug named membrane has become available that might be able to improve people's memories. Dr. Kopis puts half of her existing patients on the drug for 2 weeks while giving the other half of her patients a placebo, aka a fake drug. She then gives both groups a memory test and compares the scores. Afterwards, Dr. Kopis wonders what confounding variables may have affected the results. Dr. Kopis wanted to test the effect of the membrane drug on the memory test scores. So, the independent variable is the drug, and the dependent variable is the memory test score. The experimental group is the group that got membrane, and the control group is the one that got the placebo. Remember from the previous slide that the placebo was the fake drug. And then now for confounding variables that may have affected the results of this experiment. Remember, confounding variables are just things that would affect the results or the dependent variable that wasn't intended. So remember, the independent variable should be the only variable that affects the dependent variable. But if you design a very poor experiment, then the confounding variables may affect the dependent as well. And one thing that Dr. Kopis didn't take into account is age. So hopefully y'all are now experts at determining independent, dependent, experimental, and control. Have a good one.